If you served in the American submarine force in World War II, you had roughly a 1 in 5 chance of never coming home. That was the worst casualty rate of any branch of the US military. Worse than the infantry, worse than the bomber crews. And here's the part that should stop you. It was an all-volunteer service. Every single man asked to be there. They practiced it in a 100-foot water tower in Connecticut, breathing through a rubber bag strapped to their chest called a Momsen lung. In 4 years of war, across 52 lost submarines, it worked in combat essentially once. Everyone else went down with the boat. Now here's what the training didn't mention. Across 4 years of war and 52 lost American submarines, that escape gear was successfully used in combat on essentially one occasion. 1. In October 1944, the USS Tongue sank in the Formosa Strait after being hit by one of her own torpedoes, which ran in a circle and came back. She went down in about 180 feet of water. Shallow by the standards of the Pacific, roughly a dozen men made it into the escape trunk and tried. Fewer than half reached the surface alive. That was the good outcome. That was the shallow water, the intact compartment, the trained crew, the best case anybody ever got. Everywhere else, a submarine that was hit simply stopped transmitting. No wreckage, no bodies, no graves. The Navy would wait, and then change the boat's status to overdue, presumed lost, and 80 families would receive a telegram that couldn't tell them where their son was. So when you hear that submarine duty was hell, understand that the fear wasn't dying. Everyone in that war risked dying. The fear was dying in a sealed steel tube on the floor of the Pacific, in the dark, with no possibility that anyone would ever find you. And they volunteered for it, all of them. Part 1. Going aboard. Start with the hatch. You climb down a vertical ladder into a Gato-class fleet boat. And the first thing that hits you isn't the cramping or the noise. It's the air. Diesel oil, hot electrical insulation, battery acid, cooking grease, mildew, and the residue of every crew that came before you, baked into the paint. New men gag. Some of them are still gagging on day 3. And then, somewhere in the first week, your nose gives up. Not because the smell improves, but because your brain files it under normal and stops reporting it. You will not smell it again until you come home, and your mother won't let you in the house in that uniform. The boat itself is about 311 feet long and 27 feet wide. And if that sounds roomy, look closer. Nearly all of it is machinery. 4 diesel engines, 2 enormous banks of batteries under the deck plates, torpedo tubes, air flasks, fuel tanks, ballast tanks, hydraulic lines. The men live in whatever gaps the equipment left over, which works out to a habitable volume roughly the size of a modest house, shared by 80 people who cannot leave it for 2 months. She was designed for about 60. By 1944, she's carrying 80, because radar came along, and then better sonar. And every new system needed a specialist, and the hull never got any bigger. So they sleep in the torpedo rooms, canvas racks stacked 3 high in the gaps between live torpedoes, steel fish weighing over 3,000 pounds apiece, each carrying enough explosive to break a freighter in half. Your bed is 18 inches from the rack above it. You do not sit up in the night. You learn to roll out sideways. And because there are 80 men and nowhere near 80 bunks, you hot bunk. You work an 8-hour watch, and while you're on it, another man sleeps in your rack. When you come off, you climb into bedding that is still warm and still damp, and you sleep in the outline another man left behind. 60 nights in a row. Here's the part that surprises people. The first week is good. Fleet boats went to sea loaded with fresh provisions, and the Navy fed submariners better than anyone else in the service, deliberately, as compensation. Real eggs, real milk, steak, lettuce for about 4 days until it turned. Most fleet boats carried an ice cream machine, and it wasn't a novelty. It was morale equipment, and the crews took it seriously. So the opening days of a war patrol feel almost civilized. Full bellies, clean clothes, cold air, a boat that still smells mostly of paint. Enjoy it. In 5 weeks, none of that will be true, and the bread will have mold on it that you'll cut off and eat around. Part 2. The boat stops being livable. Let's kill a myth first, because most videos on this topic get it exactly backwards. American fleet submarines had air conditioning. Genuinely. Refrigeration plants, ducting, the works. But it wasn't installed for the crew. It was installed for the equipment. Submarines are condensation factories. Warm, humid air meets cold steel hull. Water forms on every surface, and water is death for electrical gear. Radios short, motors arc, torpedo data computers fail. The air conditioning existed to keep the boat's electronics dry, and the fact that it also made men marginally less miserable was a side effect nobody had budgeted for. Which matters enormously, because that system was one of the first things shut off when you needed to hide. When it worked, a Pacific boat sat somewhere in the high 80s, with the humidity pinned near saturation. When it was overwhelmed, and in tropical water it frequently was, the engine rooms ran past 120. Men worked 4-hour watches down there, drinking constantly, taking salt tablets on order, losing several pounds a shift in sweat alone. They'd come off watch, and their dungarees would be heavy with it. Nothing ever dried. Not clothes, not bedding, not shoes. Condensation ran down the bulkheads and dripped from the overhead onto your face while you tried to sleep. Leather rotted, paper went soft, and the men grew things. Fungal rashes in every fold of skin, and a chronic, angry heat, rash the crews called prickly heat, which spread across your back and shoulders, and never healed because it never got dry. Fresh water was rationed hard, and the priority list tells you where you stood in it. Drinking first. Cooking second. The batteries third. They needed distilled water, and without batteries, you couldn't submerge. And if you couldn't submerge, you died. Washing came fourth. Last. A shower, when you got one, was maybe 3 minutes. Sometimes salt water, and salt water won't rinse soap. You'd finish a shower feeling tackier than when you started. Most days, you got a wet rag. After a fortnight, everyone stank equally, which is its own kind of mercy. Nobody can be embarrassed if there's no one clean to be embarrassed in front of. And then there was the head. I want to be careful not to play this purely for laughs, because the men who lived it didn't find it funny at the time. A submarine toilet doesn't flush downward. There's ocean under you. At pressure, it flushes into a holding tank, which is then blown out of the boat with compressed air. And doing that requires operating a sequence of valves in exactly the right order. Get the sequence wrong. One valve open that should be shut, and the compressed air has nowhere to go but backwards, through the bowl, into the compartment, and onto whoever is standing there. They called it a blowback. Every single boat had stories. New men were genuinely afraid of the head, and experienced men enjoyed watching them work it out, and the crews turned it into a running joke because the alternative was thinking about it too hard. 2 toilets, 80 men, 60 days. Now hold all of that in your head. The heat, the filth, the exhaustion. A crew running on 4 hours of broken sleep. And add a medical emergency. In September 1942, aboard the USS Sea Dragon in the South China Sea, a 19-year-old seaman named Darrell Dean Rector developed acute appendicitis. There was no doctor. Submarines didn't carry surgeons. They carried a pharmacist's mate, a petty officer with first aid training. Getting to port would take days Rector didn't have. The pharmacist's mate was named Wheeler Lipes. He had watched surgeries performed. He had never performed one. He operated on the wardroom table. Spoons were bent into retractors. A tea strainer with gauze over it became the ether mask. Alcohol from the torpedo store served as antiseptic. The boat's officers held the lights and handed him instruments they couldn't name. And Lipes went looking for an appendix inside a teenager while the hull rocked. Rector lived. He was back on duty inside a fortnight. It happened on at least 2 other American submarines during the war, by other pharmacists' mates, in the same impossible position. The Navy's Surgeon General was reportedly furious about it. And I think the reason the story sticks isn't the improvisation. It's what it tells you about the isolation. That boat was as far from help as a man could get, and still be on Earth. Part 3. The thing nobody tells you about the torpedoes. Everything so far is the cost of getting to the target. Now imagine paying all of it, and then the weapon doesn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo was America's primary submarine weapon at the start of the war, and it was broken in at least 3 separate ways at once. It ran roughly 10 feet deeper than the depth it was set to, so it passed harmlessly under ships. Its magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a hull and break the ship's back, fired early, late, or not at all. And its backup contact pistol, the simple mechanical one, the fail-safe, had a firing pin that tended to crumple on impact when a torpedo hit square on at full speed, meaning the better your shot, the more likely it was to fail. Submarine skippers reported this from the first months of the war. The Bureau of Ordnance, which had designed and tested the weapon, largely told them they were missing. The moment it became undeniable came in July 1943. Commander Lawrence Dan Daspit in the USS Tinosa found a Japanese whale factory ship, the Tonen Maru No. 3 Tochnan Makaru, one of the largest vessels in their fleet, an enormous and almost undefended target. He hit her and stopped her dead in the water. And then he did something extraordinary. With a crippled ship sitting motionless in front of him and no escort in sight, Daspit worked his boat into perfect position and began firing torpedoes one at a time, deliberately, under textbook conditions, recording each shot, watching each one run true, watching each one strike, and watching each one fail to explode. Over and over, sailors on the target's deck could reportedly see the wakes coming. He fired most of his remaining load into a stationary ship and could not sink her. He kept his last torpedo unfired and carried it home so somebody in Pearl Harbor would finally have to look at it. Sit with what that means for the crew. 60 days of no sleep, no air, no water, no dignity. A perfect approach. And the reward for all of it is the sound of a 3,000-pound weapon hitting a hull and going clunk. The problems weren't fully sorted until late 1943, after submariners ran their own tests, including firing torpedoes into cliffs, because the Ordnance Bureau wouldn't. In my view, that's the single most undertold scandal of the Pacific War. We talk endlessly about how brutal submarine conditions were, and much less about the fact that for nearly 2 years, those men were being sent into that meat grinder with a weapon that didn't reliably work, and being told the failures were their fault. Part 4. Being hunted. There's a sound submariners describe with unusual precision, and it's not the explosion. It's the ping. Enemy sonar sweeping the water, searching, missing, and then the interval between pings shortening because they've found something and they're narrowing it down. Everyone in that boat, in every compartment, hears the same thing at the same moment and understands exactly what it means. Rig for silent running. And here's the cruel part, the part that ties everything together. To run silent, you shut down the air conditioning. It's noisy machinery, and noise is what kills you. So the moment you most need to be calm, still, and clear-headed is precisely the moment the boat starts heating up. The temperature climbs past 100, then past 110. Men strip to their shorts and lie flat in their bunks because moving generates heat and consumes oxygen. Nobody speaks. Orders travel by hand signal or by mouth against an ear. The lights are dimmed. And now every man is doing arithmetic on the same 3 numbers. How much battery is left, how much oxygen is left, and how much longer the destroyer up there is willing to wait. The depth charges come in a rhythm you learn to read. A splash far above, then nothing while it sinks, while you count, while you try to guess the depth setting from the delay. Then the detonation, and if it's close, it isn't a bang so much as a physical blow to the entire boat. Cork insulation shakes off the overhead and fills the air with white dust. Light bulbs shatter. Gauge glass cracks. Men are knocked off their feet, and the hull rings like a struck bell, and everyone waits to hear whether the ringing is followed by the sound of water. Beyond a certain point, the danger stops, being the explosion, and becomes the boat's own chemistry. Sprung seams let seawater into the battery compartment, and seawater meeting sulfuric acid produces chlorine gas. Now you're not just being bombed in the dark, you're being bombed in the dark in a sealed container that has begun manufacturing poison. They had counters. Good skippers hunted for the thermal layer, a boundary where water temperature changes sharply and sonar bends away from it, and hid underneath. They ran deep, they ran quiet, they turned into the attacker's baffles, they released decoys. Sometimes they blew debris and a slick of oil out of a tube to fake their own destruction, and then sat perfectly still while the enemy congratulated themselves overhead. And sometimes none of it worked, and you simply had to outlast them. The USS Puffer became the study case for that. In October 1943, in the Makassar Strait, she was pinned down and held under by Japanese escorts for something on the order of a day and a half without surfacing. The temperature inside reportedly passed 125 degrees. The air went foul, then dangerous. Men lay motionless in their own sweat, some of them semi-conscious, some hallucinating, while the pinging continued above them hour after hour. She'd survived, but the crew's condition when she finally surfaced was serious enough that the Navy studied the incident specifically to understand how long human beings could actually endure it. That's the detail I keep coming back to. The Navy had to run a study because until Puffer, nobody actually knew where the limit was. Some men found out they were past theirs. There were breakdowns, men who screamed, men who had to be physically held down, men who simply stopped responding and stared at a bulkhead for hours. And here I want to be fair to the submarine service, because it did something the rest of the military in that era mostly didn't. A man who came back from a patrol and said he couldn't do another one was generally transferred, without a formal disgrace attached. The reasoning was cold, rather than compassionate. A man who cracks at 200 feet endangers 80 others. But the effect was that submariners were spared some of the cowardice shaming that crews in other branches faced. Part 5. The other side of the war. Everything described so far is the American experience. It was, by a wide margin, the more comfortable one. A German Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the Atlantic, was around 220 feet long, substantially smaller than an American fleet boat, and carried somewhere in the region of 44 to 52 men. No air conditioning, no ice cream machine, no fresh water still worth the name. The boat had 2 heads, and on departure, one of them was routinely packed floor to ceiling with food, because there was nowhere else to put it. So roughly 50 men shared a single toilet for the opening weeks of a patrol, and the second one only came into service once the crew had eaten their way into it. Provisions hung from the overhead in nets throughout the living spaces because the boat had no proper cold storage. Men walked bent over beneath swinging sausages and bread that grew a white fur the crews nicknamed for the rabbits it resembled. Condensation was worse than on American boats, not better, because there was no dehumidifying plant at all. Everything was permanently soaked, and the odds were catastrophically worse. Germany's U-boat arm suffered the highest loss rate of any substantial fighting force in the entire war. The commonly cited figure is that roughly 3/4 of the men who sailed in them never came back. Around 30,000 dead out of some 40,000 who served. After spring 1943, when Allied air cover, radar, and code breaking closed the Atlantic Gap, sending a U-boat on patrol was close to a sentence. So when you weigh American submarine service, the appalling heat, the filth, the 1 in 5 odds, hold it against the fact that the men on the other side of that war were enduring the same confinement, worse sanitation, worse food, and roughly 3 times the chance of dying. Part 6. What it cost, and why they went anyway. The American numbers are stark enough on their own. 52 submarines lost, around 3,500 submariners killed out of roughly 16,000 who served, about a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any branch of the United States Armed Forces in the Second World War, higher than the infantry, higher than the bomber crews over Germany. That force made up under 2% of the US Navy. It sank somewhere around 55% of all Japanese shipping lost in the war. 2% of the men, more than half the tonnage. There is no other statistic in the Pacific War with that shape. And when a boat didn't come home, there was nothing to bury. Overdue, presumed lost. No wreck location, no confirmed date. Often no idea what had even happened. Families were left with a telegram and a hole. Some of those boats were only found on the seabed in the last 20 years, which means there are people alive today who finally learned where their grandfather has been lying since 1944. Which brings us to the question that actually matters. Why did anyone volunteer? Some of it was money. Submarine duty carried substantial hazard pay, commonly cited at around 50% above base. And for men who'd grown up in the Depression and were sending money home, that was not a small thing. Some of it was status. You couldn't be assigned to submarines. You had to be selected. Psychological screening, physical standards, technical aptitude tests. Getting in was an achievement, and submariners knew it and behaved accordingly. And some of it was the fortnight in between. Because here's the detail that captures the whole strange bargain of that service. When a boat came back to Pearl Harbor, the crew wasn't sent to a barracks. They were sent to the Royal Hawaiian, a pink luxury resort hotel on Waikiki Beach that the Navy had taken over as a submarine rest camp. Clean sheets, real food served on plates, a beach, 2 weeks of being treated like a paying guest at one of the finest hotels in the Pacific. Then you got back on the boat. I don't think anything says it better than that. The service was so brutal that the Navy's considered solution was a beachfront hotel, and the men took the deal and went down the hatch again. 60 more days, 1 in 5. Ask them afterwards, and most of them won't lead with the heat or the depth charges. They'll tell you about the crew, about the fact that on a submarine, there is no such thing as somebody else's job. That when a seam opens at 300 feet, an 18-year-old torpedo man's hands are the only thing between 80 men and the Pacific. Every man aboard knew, precisely and without sentiment, that his life was in the hands of the people around him, and that theirs were in his. But the smell is what stayed. Decades later, at reunions, in nursing homes, veterans would say the same thing in almost the same words, that they could still smell it. Diesel and battery acid and mildew and sweat. All of it fused into something no one else on Earth would recognize, sitting in the back of the nose of a man in his 80s, who last went to sea in 1945.